Our guest today is Lyla Hunt, Director of Public Health and Education at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. Lyla has been with the office since the very first day, having transferred from the New York State Department of Health. Lyla has a master's degree in public health from the University of Albany School of Public Health. Welcome, Lyla. It's great to see you.
Herb, it's so great to see you and so nice to be on. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, thank you for taking the time. So, your role at OCM sits at the intersection of science, policy, and community. Can you walk us through what the job, looks like day to day, and what drew you specifically to do this work in cannabis?
Absolutely. So in 2018, there was a tiny line in the New York State budget that called for the impact assessment, was a study whether or not to legalize cannabis. And that was when I was at the Department of Health and I was working at the Office of Drug User Health, which was a newer agency at the time. I was doing special projects work. And it ended up coming to me to be the lead author of that report, which led to, I can only describe it as getting hooked on phonics, falling completely in love with the work in cannabis and public health and cannabis, and that intersection is kind of a newer thing. It was, especially in 2018 at the time, it was like, writing the playbook. What does it mean to protect public health and safety with cannabis legalization? So that's everything from rulemaking to make sure that we have consumer protections and safeguards in place to monitoring the data to look at the impacts of cannabis legalization across different populations and different health outcomes. And I think germane to what we're going to talk about today is educating the public. And that's, again, it's everyone from cannabis consumers to John Q. Public to, specific targeted populations that need tailored education to understand what cannabis legalization means for them and their lives.
And you reminded me of something about that time with Governor Cuomo. There was a meeting that I attended and it was, Governor Cuomo had a joint meeting with the governors of the state of New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. And I remember the senator now from Pennsylvania was the lieutenant governor at the time, and he attended. And the idea was to have a sort of comprehensive regional approach to cannabis legalization, and to have similar taxation, similar rules, policies, maybe share some labs. And it was a great idea, great meeting. And after that, it really went nowhere, and I don't know where it sort of fell off. But it was a great idea. But I was just reminded of that, so thank you. So, from a public health standpoint, what do you see as OCM's most urgent business?
There's so much, Herb. I think legalization happened and access expanded before New Yorkers were really ready. So there's, really from the education perspective, this sort of fundamental basics around the cannabis law that we all take for granted. What is the legal age to purchase and consume in New York? Where can you consume legally? All of those rules are things that we're finding like 25% of New Yorkers are aware of. So that's essential, is making sure folks understand the basics of the cannabis law and what cannabis means to them. But we're also just seeing, like, I think there's such a need, and we're going to get into this today, I suspect, but there's such a need for tailored information about cannabis. It impacts everyone's lives, whether people choose to consume or not, and making sure that we're giving them the education that's best catered to their needs is how we ultimately end up even looking at policies and looking at epidemiological data. That's how we end up seeing better outcomes for New Yorkers, is starting with education first.
All right, well, terrific. Well, we're here today to talk about the Listen and Learn report that OCM recently issued. Can you describe what the listen and learn sessions were, how they were structured, what they were designed to do, and and just sort of describe the effort.
Absolutely. So the Listen and Learn report is a summary of more than 450 different New Yorkers. The voices of those New Yorkers are represented in that report. It was basically a year-long initiative that the office engaged in. We partnered with community-based organizations. We had 23 different sessions where we brought together groups of young people and then separately brought together groups of parents, trusted adults, grandparents, and caregivers. We asked them What do you know about cannabis? What do you want to know about cannabis? And how do you want that information delivered to you? We're gearing up right now and this will be coming later this summer, to release a campaign for young people and parents and trusted adults in New York State for the very first time. And so we wanted to start by basically doing this needs assessment. What do you need? If we want to meet people where they are, let's start by asking them, where are you? And so it was a really eye-opening experience. We learned just how much work we have to do in this space. We learned how much misinformation there is out there, how deeply ingrained in some communities that misinformation really is. And especially with young people, we often see public education campaigns with big spends behind them, are built around assumptions, and no one's doing that work to first just ask people, what do you need? So this is a lengthy report that summarizes each of the voices that we heard, each of the perspectives that we heard, and I think really helps, hopefully not just the office, but partners across the state think intentionally about what it means to educate the public after cannabis legalization, for young people, families, communities writ large.
So why was it important for OCM to do this at all? What is it about hearing directly from community members that you really couldn't capture any other way?
Sure. I think cannabis is more visible now in communities on social media. When you're driving down the road, we have, many dispensaries open now. It's part of everyday life, it's in the news, and that visibility doesn't necessarily translate into understanding. So the report identified for us what we're calling, what we deemed the normalization gap. Cannabis is visible everywhere, but education often starts too late. We heard from some young people, like, when did cannabis start to, enter your brain? When were you aware of it? And despite the fact that, most start to, at least on the formal side, learn about cannabis in health class, in, later middle or early high school, some of them are learning about cannabis as young as 6 years old. And so we're on the public health side, on the education side, we're starting too late. So we need to to work more quickly to get up to speed with this normalization gap. And we wanted to sort of understand how young people and families were navigating that reality. So, again, instead of relying on assumptions, we grounded our work in lived experiences and went out into the community, and heard from folks directly.
So, after 23 sessions and speaking to over 450 people, over 300, young people, what was the single most sort of surprising comment or reaction or conclusion that you heard, and what really blew you away in the discussion?
So much. I think we, in general, as adults, don't give young people enough credit for how sophisticated they are. They are consuming a ton of media, and we often say, they don't have very long attention spans. And while that might be true, they're dealing with a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance. The number one thing we heard, this came up in 85% of the discussions that we listen to, both on the young people side and from adults directly, is that mental health is one of the biggest challenges of this generation. And that's not
And I was surprised by that because I think the number was like 85% of respondents I sort of talked about mental health as being one of the things that they associated most with cannabis.
And not just with cannabis, right? So they are, we asked them, what's the biggest thing that you're dealing with in your generation? And they said mental health issues. We have trauma. We are trying to learn how to cope with that trauma. We have just general anxiety. Maybe we have depression. Maybe it's a formal diagnosis. Maybe it's not. Maybe we have access to services. Maybe we don't. And so, in absence of having some of that, mental health support, folks are finding a way to cope. And sometimes, yes, that's cannabis, and sometimes it's not. But regardless, there's this understanding that cannabis has medicinal value. And they're trying to fit that in the context of, these broader mental health challenges. So I think that's really an opportunity, for us as educators and for us as the office, is let's make sure folks understand the nuances because there's a ton of nuance about cannabis and mental health, and there's some real risks that need to be explored. The other thing young people told us was, um, we don't want fear based messaging. We want just the facts. Just give us the facts. And not just cannabis has an impact on the developing brain, but what parts of the developing brain and what impacts. They wanna know that detail, and they're really interested in actually the science. So from the public health perspective, that was great to hear and to see. And the other key point that I wanna land on is that about 60% of the young people we talk to, we ask them, who are you most likely to turn to when you have, or where are you going to go when you have questions about cannabis? 60% of them told us our parents. So parents are still this trusted source of information. And then conversely, when we had conversation with adults, we said, do you feel ready for that conversation? If the young
And that
people
was actually that was actually my next question, because you described a trust gap, but it's not what I thought it was going to be, right? I mean, the young people are looking to their parents and caregivers for this
right.
information, but it really was more that the adults didn't feel knowledgeable, competent enough, confident enough to educate and speak to young people about cannabis.
Exactly. 1 in 10 adults told us they were ready for that conversation. And there was even that confusion about, like I mentioned earlier, the legal age to consume that adults weren't aware of. So they're asking us, can you give us the facts so that we can be ready for that conversation? So not to get too ahead of ourselves here, but the campaign that we're working to build right now, the listen and learn identified the questions. The campaign will come later and it'll help provide some of those answers and fill in some of those gaps that we identified. And that campaign is really going to focus on that intersection, that relationship between the young people and the parents and trusted adults, and lifting up the parents and trusted adults with the information and the facts so that they can have that supported conversation or series of conversations. We know it's not just a one and done, check the box kind of exercise. So we're really excited to see that come to fruition.
Now, you're obviously experienced in government, and you've seen, I'm sure, tons of reports get written, and excellent reports, and then they get put on a shelf, and you never hear about them again. So how is this going to be different? How is OCM really going to make use of the information gained in this report?
Yeah, it's such a great point. For us, this is really the blueprint.
Mhm.
And we're taking this and we're working with a media partner now, and we're building a campaign that speaks to the gaps and the needs that we identified. And we're really excited about that because, once we do release a campaign, it means that we can go back to the communities and the community based organizations that we worked with in the Listen and Learn report, and have another conversation. That was a finding we had in the report was how much community enjoyed having a space to have conversations like this, um, with sort of that facilitated discussion across groups. And so we're really excited to sort of bring this forward. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is we, as part of the Listen and Learn report, we've
Mhm.
released this community engagement guide. So it kind of calls forward some of the key points from the report, some of the key actions we've learned, distills them in a high level because we know at the Office of Cannabis Management, we're well aware of the fact that we have a very large state to cover, and that this work is done best when we do it in partnership with community. So we're hoping folks will use that community engagement guide and continue the conversation.
And you mentioned that New York is a very large state, and did you hear different messaging in different parts of the state? I mean, was Buffalo saying the same thing that Brooklyn was saying?
Yeah, surprisingly, many areas had very similar findings. There were nuances, especially when it came to slang. So we often started these conversations by asking people like, "What terms do you use when we say cannabis? What do you think of?" And there's a Venn diagram in the report that shows what young people said and what adults say. And if you break down those findings, there are a lot of regional variations and differences across the state. But actually, one of my favorite findings from that exercise is just the basic fundamental conversation between parents, trusted adults, and young people. We're often not using the same word to talk about the plant. So if we start from just defining our terms, I think that's a really great starting place, and a really interesting finding to explore.
So now both groups, the young people and the adults, express a desire to keep the conversation going, right? And one youth participant even said, this is the first time anybody's asked what we think. So what do you do with that now?
Yeah, I think we keep the conversation going. We rely on our community partners to do that, and we at the office will certainly be doing that. We had such rich findings from this. We made such great connections. The stories, the report is a summary, but the stories behind it. There was one conversation in Western New York. We had, it just tells this generational story, right? So we had for an adult session, a older brother and a younger brother, and there was probably a decade age gap between them. And they were talking both about their experiences getting caught with cannabis growing up. And the older brother, same set of parents, but the older brother had this really rigid, strict reaction when he was caught with cannabis. And just 10 years later, his younger brother they started to actually have a little bit of a dialogue. And then the beauty of this exercise was the next day we talked to a younger relative in one of our youth sessions of the same brothers. And he was caught with cannabis. He actually went to his parent to start the conversation himself and ask some questions. So just seeing that generational evolution was really, really intriguing and interesting. I mean, you ask about regional differences. I think the generational differences are so profound and often just like a really deep gap that we need to do some work to further explore.
And even in the tools that they asked for, there was a dramatic difference, right? The young people wanted sort of, social media type of tools, while the adults wanted basically things that they could hold in their hands and read.
hmm Yeah, perhaps not the most surprising finding that the young people are very digital these days and wanted short form video content. But we heard from, parents and trusted adults, they wanted a website, they wanted something interactive, they wanted video content, and actually more from schools and guidance counselors and camp counselors. They wanted collateral. They wanted something tangible they could hold in their hands, some print material they could share at a resource fair or a tabling or event, or if they're responding to, especially in schools, if they're responding to an incident, they want to send folks home with something. So that's where we need to do some work is making sure that we have materials across that sort of different wish list.
Yeah. No, and the other thing that was interesting, youth were pretty clear that they didn't want to be talked at, right? That they wanted to participate in creating the content for their generation. And I'm not sure whether you got the same kind of response from the adults. But again, how do you take advantage of that and do something with it now that you know that?
Yeah, it's sort of that principle, nothing about us without us. We want a seat at the table. We want to be part of co-creating the materials with you. Um, we heard that from adults too. Young people definitely emphasized, don't try and sound like us. You won't sound cool. It'll be cringe. We will definitely not engage if you sound too much like us. But part of what we've done to help us as we build this campaign I spoke of is to create the Cannabis Education Advisory Panel. So we've brought together a group of experts across the state um, that serve young people and families, whether that be through community-based organizations or clinicians or educators. We brought together that panel as well as some of our state agency partners. And it's been fantastic because as we're building resources, we show them content, draft content, definitely, give us feedback on the tone, the look, the feel. And we've been able to leverage their networks to go out and engage directly with young people and do the same thing. Here's an ad. Are you responding to the way this is talking? Is the imagery right? Imagery right? Is the tone right? Is the vibe right? Kind of dissect it with us and basically do that kind of focus group work. So we're really excited to continue exploring that co-creation element that we learned was so important.
So now, if a parent or caregiver, listens to this, and is having the same anxieties and concerns that the adults in your groups, demonstrated, like, what would you say to them now? How could they sort of learn and get comfortable in having these conversations?
Yeah, it's so hard. Everyone's starting from a different place, right? Like we recognize that some people are cannabis consumers themselves. So when they're talking to the young person, they have a deeper understanding, but they also have to sort of distance their own relationship with the plant at times, depending on their message. And then same with, medical cannabis participants. They have a different interaction with the plant. And so everyone's starting from a different place, and every relationship is different. But that's why, from the state's perspective, from my perspective as a public health practitioner, leaning on that trusted adult and lifting them up is the key to success because we're never going to replicate the relationship between a young person and a trusted adult. That takes trust and that takes time. And so instead, I think that's the point of intervention. That's the discussion is how can we make sure that those folks are ready for that conversation? How can we take that 1 in 10 individuals, adults feeling comfortable having that conversation? How can we invert that? And that's the work.
Do you currently have any tools on the OCM website or on YouTube that trusted adults can take a look at?
Yes, we do. So, cannabis.ny.gov/education. We have our cannabis education library. There's 35 plus different print materials in a variety of languages on a variety of topics. So, we cover medical cannabis program. We cover special populations, including young people. So, there's some resources there. I will say we continue to add and expand resources every day. Feels like every day, so we should definitely encourage folks to continue to look at that. Those materials can also be ordered and delivered to you free of charge. So that is something that we continue to see community-based organizations, hospitals, dispensaries, etc. Do, and we want to encourage that for sure.
Well, what's the follow up to this report now?
Next steps, Herb, I'm so glad you asked, is we will be launching a campaign to speak to the questions we identified in the Listen and Learn report. There are, as you mentioned, so many different types of materials that people asked for, different formats that they want this information. And now it is our job to take what we learned and implement them in all of those different formats. So we are building actively right now that campaign that will be coming out later this summer. So please do stay tuned. We're super excited for that to come out. I think the New Yorkers definitely told us they want this information and they want it from a trusted source. So we are so excited to answer that call.
So now, was this all done in house? Did you work with an outside entity to get this done?
Right. So 23 different listening sessions. We had 19 community-based organizations. So, in order to talk, especially with young people about cannabis, you have to go where they already feel comfortable. So we went everywhere from cultural centers, community centers to summer camps to BOCES and schools, going into environments where folks were already comfortable and often using facilitators that we would train on the OCM side, but facilitators from those different organizations so that it was a trusted voice kind of leading the conversation and handling that discussion. All right.
Well, thank you for your time today, Lila. It's great to see you. Lyla Hunt, Director of Public Health and Education, New York State OCM, and Taylor Randy Lee. Thank you for making this happen today.